The alley was her kingdom, and the first rule of the kingdom was to see everything and be seen by no one. From her throne and overturned milk crate tucked behind a foul-smelling dumpster, Maya watched the world through a shimmering curtain of Chicago rain. At 14, she was a ghost in a city of ghosts, a wisp of a girl in a hoodie 3 sizes too big, with dark, watchful eyes that missed nothing. The hunger in her stomach was a dull, familiar ache, a constant companion she had long since learned to ignore. Hunger made you weak. Ignoring it made you strong. Across the street was the corner diner, a beacon of warmth and light against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It was a snow globe of a different life, one with steaming plates, easy laughter, and people who didn't flinch at the sound of sirens. Maya watched them like a naturalist, studying a foreign species. The way they held their forks, the way they dabbed their mouths with paper napkins, the casual way they left a few dollars on the table, as if it were nothing. Her focus narrowed on one booth in particular. It was occupied by a man and a woman, a study in contrasts. The man looked like the city itself, worn down, gray at the temples, and carrying a weight that seemed to bend his shoulders even when he was sitting. He was a cop. Maya knew the look. It was in the set of his jaw, the tired drag of his gaze as it scanned the room. A habit he couldn't turn off. He was a creature of authority, a symbol of the system that had chewed her up and spit her out into this alley. He was everything she'd been taught to fear. The woman was his opposite, polished, perfect. Her black dress was a slash of ink against the diner's red vinyl. Her blonde hair, a flawless helmet. She was a porcelain doll that had never seen a crack, her smile bright, practiced, and utterly empty. She touched the man's hand, her manicured fingers a stark white against his weathered skin, and said something Maya couldn't hear. The man, Jack Callahan, just nodded, his eyes lost somewhere in the swirling coffee in his mug. Maya felt a familiar pang of invisibility. To them, she wasn't even a shadow. She was nothing. She was about to look away, to search for a drier place to spend the night, when the man stood up and walked toward the back of the diner, toward the restrooms. The woman, Isabella, remained. And that's when the world tilted. Her smile vanished the instant the man was out of sight. It didn't fade. It was extinguished, like a flipped switch. Her face became a mask of cold, hard calculation. Her movements were a study in stealth, honed and precise. Her eyes darted around the diner, a quick, bird-like check of her surroundings. They swept right past the rain-streaked window Maya was peering through, seeing only her own reflection. Satisfied, she reached into her designer handbag. Her hand emerged not with a phone or a lipstick, but with a small, clear vial, no bigger than her thumb. It was filled with a fine white powder. Maya's breath hitched. The rain, the city, the hunger, it all faded away. There was only the woman, the booth, and the vial. With a flick of her wrist, Isabella uncapped it. Her hand trembled, just slightly, the only crack in her perfect facade. She leaned forward, using her body to shield her actions from the rest of the diner. With a quick, deliberate tap, she emptied the contents of the vial into the man's half-full coffee mug. The powder dissolved instantly, leaving no trace, no cloudiness, nothing. She gave the coffee a brief, casual stir with his spoon, then placed it back on the saucer exactly as it had been. She leaned back, and the smile returned, locking perfectly back into place. The entire act had taken less than 5 seconds. It was murder in miniature, silent and seamless. Maya was frozen. The cold from the wet concrete seeped into her bones, but a different, deeper chill spread through her chest. It wasn't just shock, it was memory. A flickering, agonizing flash from a life she barely remembered. A different kitchen. The scent of her mother's perfume mixed with something acrid. A glass of juice on a table. A hand, a strange hand, doing something just like that. A silent scream trapped in a 4-year-old's throat. The memory was a phantom limb, an ache for a part of her that had been violently amputated. Her mind screamed at her, "Run. Forget you saw it. It's not your problem." He was a cop. A white cop. The world had taught her, in 1,000 small and brutal ways, that people like him were not on her side. The system he represented was a machine, and she was just one of the broken pieces it had discarded. What did she owe him? Nothing. Helping him could only bring trouble. They would turn it on her. A homeless black girl accusing a rich, beautiful white woman. She knew how that story ended. She'd seen it play out time and time again. Her fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms. The man, Jack, was walking back to the booth. He looked tired. He looked like he was carrying the world on his back. He looked like a man about to take his last drink of coffee. "Don't do it," the voice of survival whispered. "He's not your family. He's not your responsibility. You have to save yourself." But the other voice, the one that sounded like her mother's fading lullaby, the one that remembered a home before the alley, screamed louder. Wrong was wrong. It didn't have a color. It didn't wear a uniform. It was a poison poured into a cup when no one was looking. And she was looking. Jack sat down. He gave Isabella a weary smile, a genuine one this time, and it made the betrayal seem 100 times worse. He wrapped his cold hands around the mug, lifting it from the saucer. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of the rain. It was now or never. The little girl who couldn't scream 10 years ago was gone. She didn't run. She launched. She burst from the alley, a small, desperate projectile against the storm. She didn't check for traffic, didn't care about the horns that blared in protest. Her bare feet slapped against the wet asphalt, sending up sprays of dirty water. She slammed the diner door open. The little bell above it shrieked. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The clatter of a fork hitting a plate echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. Jack's mug was inches from his lips. His tired eyes widened, locking onto the soaking, wild-eyed girl who had just shattered the peace of his world. Maya's voice, raw and cracked from disuse, ripped through the air. "Don't drink it. There's poison in it." The silence that followed Maya's cry was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the diner's warm, greasy air. Every eye was on her, a drenched, shivering girl with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. For a split second, she saw herself through their eyes. A problem, a disruption, a piece of the city's grime that had wandered inside. Isabella was the first to react. Her performance was instantaneous and masterful. Her face crumpled into an expression of shocked, tearful vulnerability. "Oh my God, Jack," she gasped, shrinking back against the vinyl booth. "This child, where did she come from? She's trying to rob us." The accusation landed, and the mood in the diner shifted from confusion to hostility. The owner, a beefy man named Sal with a stained apron, was already moving around the counter, his face a thundercloud. "Hey, you, get out of here. I'm calling the cops." "The cops are already here," a new voice cut in. A younger man in a sharp suit stood up from a nearby table. Detective Davis, Jack's mentee, clean-cut and ambitious, with none of Jack's world weariness. He strode forward, his hand instinctively going to his hip, his expression a mixture of annoyance and authority. He saw a street kid and a public disturbance. It was a simple equation. "All right, that's enough," Davis said, his voice firm as he tried to put himself between Maya and the table. "Let's go, young lady. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." He reached for her arm. Maya flinched away, her heart pounding. "No, I saw her. She put something in his coffee," she insisted, her voice trembling but fierce. Her gaze remained locked on Jack, pleading with him. He was the only one who mattered. Isabella let out a sob, burying her face in her hands. Why would she say such a horrible thing? "Jack, make her stop." Jack hadn't moved. The mug was still frozen in his hands, inches from his face. His mind, trained by 30 years of reading liars, cheats, and killers, was a whirlwind. Every logical part of him sided with Isabella. This was his fiancée, the woman who had brought light back into his life after years of darkness. The accuser was a homeless kid, likely unstable, probably desperate. It was an open and shut case of a shakedown gone wrong. But his gut, the old, reliable instinct that had kept him alive through countless bad calls and dangerous nights, was screaming. He looked at Maya. He saw the terror in her eyes, but it wasn't the shifty fear of a liar caught in the act. It was deeper. It was the absolute, paralyzing fear of someone who wasn't being believed. It was the fear of being invisible, of screaming a truth that no one would hear. And then he looked at Isabella. Her grief was a little too perfect, a little too theatrical. There was a tremor in her hands that didn't match the practiced sorrow on her face. "Davis, wait," Jack said, his voice quiet but commanding. Davis stopped, surprised. "Jack, it's just a kid looking for a handout. Let's get her out of here so you and Isabella can have some peace." "She put powder in it," Maya blurted out, seizing the momentary pause. "A little bottle. When you went to the bathroom." She poured it in. The detail was specific. Too specific for a random panicked lie. Jack slowly lowered the mug, placing it back on the saucer with a soft click that echoed through the silent diner. He looked at the dark liquid, then back at Maya. His mind flashed back over the past few months. The dizzy spells he'd dismissed as stress. The persistent fatigue he'd blamed on his age. The way Isabella had constantly fussed over his health, insisting he take vitamins, making him special teas, her concern always bordering on something else. Something he couldn't name. "This is insane," Isabella said, her voice rising with a sharp edge of hysteria. "Jack, are you really going to listen to this? This filth over me? Look at her. Who knows what diseases she has?" The insult was designed to dehumanize, to turn Maya into an object of disgust. It almost worked. The other patrons murmured in agreement. But the barb had the opposite effect on Jack. It was cruel. It was unnecessary. And it betrayed a flicker of genuine panic in Isabella's eyes. He made a decision. It went against procedure, against protocol, and against the woman he was supposed to marry. But it aligned with the one thing he had left to trust, his gut. "Sal," Jack said, his voice steady as he looked at the diner owner, "get me a plastic bag, one of the Ziploc ones you use for sandwiches, and a lid for this cup." Sal blinked, confused. "A bag? What for?" "And nobody touches this table," Jack commanded, his voice regaining the authority of a lead detective at a crime scene. Isabella stared at him, her beautiful face, a canvas of disbelief and horror. "Jack, what are you doing? You can't be serious." "I'm being thorough," he replied, his gaze unreadable. He turned to his stunned partner. "Davis, call it in. I want this mug taken to the lab and its contents tested. Full toxicology screen." Davis's jaw dropped. "Jack, for a crazy story from a street kid, we can't just waste department resources like that. The captain will have our badges. Then I'll pay for it myself," Jack snapped, his patience finally fraying. "Just do it." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Davis, though bewildered, pulled out his phone and walked toward the door to make the call. The diner was electric with tension. Maya stood frozen, watching the man she had tried to save. He hadn't dismissed her. He hadn't had her thrown out. He had listened. A tiny, unfamiliar flicker of something warm ignited in her chest. Jack's eyes found hers again. He didn't offer a smile or a word of thanks. His expression was grim, heavy with the weight of what he had just set in motion. He had thrown a grenade into the middle of his own life, and it was all based on the desperate cry of a girl from an alley. He looked from Maya's terrified, resolute face to Isabella's crumbling composure. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that by the time the lab results came back, his world would be irrevocably broken. The only question left was which of them had been telling the truth. The waiting was its own form of torture. For 24 hours, the world held its breath. Maya was placed in the temporary custody of Child Protective Services, a sterile environment that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. She answered their questions with single-syllable responses, her guard so high it was a physical wall. She was a witness, they said, a person of interest. To her, the words meant the same thing. She was in the system, a cog in the machine she had tried so hard to avoid. Jack spent the night on the lumpy couch in his office, the silence of the precinct, a stark contrast to the storm raging in his head. He didn't go home. He couldn't face the pristine apartment he shared with Isabella, couldn't look at the framed photos of them smiling, a gallery of lies. He replayed Maya's desperate cry, Isabella's flawless outrage, his own cold dread. It was a loop of doubt and betrayal. The call came just after dawn. It was from the head of the toxicology lab, a man Jack had known for 20 years. His voice was grim. "Jack, you need to come down here. Just tell me, Frank," Jack said, his voice a low rasp. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It wasn't street poison, nothing fast or messy. This was sophisticated, a custom synthesized beta blocker derivative, aerosolized into a crystalline powder, odorless, tasteless. In small repeated doses, it mimics the effects of chronic stress on the cardiovascular system. Weakness, arrhythmia, fatigue. Eventually, cardiac arrest. It would have looked like a heart attack, a tired cop working himself into an early grave. The clinical description was more chilling than any street name for poison. It was methodical. It was patient. It was personal. The truth hit Jack, not like a wave, but like a block of ice forming in his chest. His life with Isabella hadn't been a partnership. It had been an assassination in slow motion. He hung up the phone, the world muted and gray. The interrogation room was cold. Isabella sat opposite him, her lawyer by her side. The facade of the victim was gone, replaced by one of defiant, icy fury. She had refused to speak to anyone but him. "I hope you're happy, Jack," she began, her voice dripping with venom. "You've destroyed us, all because of some lying junkie kid from the gutter." The lab results came back, Isabella," Jack said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He laid the report on the metal table between them. It was poison. Her composure cracked. Just for a second, a flicker of raw panic shot through her eyes before she extinguished it. Her lawyer put a restraining hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "I was forced to do it." The words burst out of her, a desperate last-ditch defense. "They made me. They would have killed me. They would have killed us." Jack leaned forward. The detective in him took over, pushing past the pain of the betrayed fiancé. "Who is they, Isabella? Who made you do this?" She started to shake her head, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine terror. I can't say. You don't understand who you're dealing with. They're everywhere." She looked at him, her gaze suddenly pleading. "I did it to save you, don't you see? They wanted you gone quickly. I was trying to buy us time, to find a way out. It was a good story, almost believable. But Jack had heard 1,000 good stories from 1,000 guilty people. "My mentee, Detective Davis, is processing your arrest warrant right now," he said, his voice like stone. "You have one last chance to tell me who is behind this." She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The fear in her eyes was real, but it was the fear of a cornered accomplice, not an unwilling victim. She chose her side. Her lawyer leaned in and whispered in her ear, and she fell silent, her jaw tight. The conversation was over. As 2 uniformed officers came in to escort her out, Jack stood up to leave. He felt hollowed out, a building gutted by fire. As she passed him, her hands cuffed behind her back, Isabella leaned in close, her breath warm against his ear. Her whisper was so low it was almost lost in the sterile hum of the room, a secret passed between 2 people who now shared nothing but a crime. Silas Thorne. The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Silas Thorne, the untouchable real estate magnate, the philanthropist with the soul of a viper. The man Jack had been chasing for a decade, a ghost who ran half the city's organized crime from a penthouse suite, always insulated by layers of lawyers and shell corporations. He was Jack's white whale, the one case he could never make stick. Isabella was being led away, her parting shot hanging in the air like poison gas. She hadn't just tried to kill him. She had been a soldier in a war he thought he was about to retire from. But now, he saw the devastating truth. The war had followed him home, sat at his dinner table, and slept in his bed. And the opening salvo had just been fired, not by him, but at him. The debt Jack owed was absolute. It wasn't a matter of gratitude. It was a stark mathematical equation. His life, measured in heartbeats, now belonged on the other side of a ledger, credited to a 14-year-old girl. He found Maya at the CPS intake center, a place that smelled of bleach and quiet desperation. She was sitting in a plastic chair in a hallway, looking smaller and more lost than she had in the diner. She was just a kid, stripped of the fierce protective shell she wore in the alley. When she saw him approach, her entire body tensed. To her, he was still the system, the authority, the man in charge. "They told me what was in the coffee," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. His voice was rough. "You saved my life." Maya just shrugged, her gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the linoleum floor. "I saw something. I said something." "Most people wouldn't have," Jack replied, the truth of it landing heavily between them. He knew he couldn't just leave her here. The system that was meant to protect children like her was a labyrinth of overworked caseworkers and underfunded programs. She would become a number, a file, another forgotten case. He owed her more than that. He cleared it with the on-duty supervisor, pulling the strings his badge still allowed him to pull. He was taking her for a meal, he said, and to get her some new clothes. It was the least he could do. The silence in his car was thick. Maya stared out the window, her face a carefully blank mask. He took her to a Target, a place so aggressively normal it felt alien. As he watched her hesitantly pick out a new hoodie, jeans, and a pair of sturdy sneakers, the awkwardness of the situation settled on him. He was a cop. She was a street kid. They were from different planets, orbiting the same dying star. Later, over a meal at a quiet, family-style restaurant, he tried to bridge the gap. "Do you have any family, Maya?" he asked gently. She shook her head, not looking up from the hamburger she was methodically dissecting. "The people at the center need a full name for their records," he pressed, trying to sound official rather than prying. "Just a last name." She hesitated for a long moment, then mumbled, "It's Vance." The name didn't just ring a bell. It was a siren, screaming in the archives of his memory. Vance. A cold dread, colder than the ice in his chest after Isabella's confession, washed over him. He felt a sudden, sickening sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He ended the meal quickly, his mind racing. He drove Maya back to the center, promising her he'd be back the next day to check on her, a promise that sounded hollow even to his own ears. She watched him leave with the same guarded, untrusting eyes. Jack drove back to the precinct, breaking every speed limit. He didn't go to his office. He went to the basement, to the cold, dead files. The room smelled of dust and decaying paper, the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten tragedies. It took him 20 minutes of searching through the V's for the year he was looking for. He finally pulled out a thin, faded manila folder. The label, typed in stark black ink, read, "Vance, Massachusetts, RCU, and Anna. Deceased." His own signature was at the bottom of the closing report, dated 10 years ago. He sank onto a dusty stool, the file open on his lap. He remembered the case, vaguely at first, then with a gut-wrenching clarity. A young black couple, both freelance journalists, found in their South Side apartment. The official cause of death was accidental carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty boiler. It had been a tragic, straightforward case, open and shut. But reading the notes now, with the name Silas Thorne burning in his mind, the details he'd dismissed as insignificant leaped off the page. The anonymous tip about the boiler came after the bodies were discovered, not before. The building's maintenance logs for that month were missing. A neighbor who reported hearing a loud argument earlier that night had recanted her statement the next day, suddenly terrified and uncooperative. At the time, he'd been a younger detective, eager to clear cases, to keep the numbers moving. He had accepted the simple explanation. He hadn't dug deeper. He hadn't wanted to see what might be lurking beneath the surface of a simple, tragic accident involving a black family in a rough part of town. He hadn't seen it as his fight. He flipped to the last page of the report, the social services addendum. It was a single, stark sentence. One surviving child, Maya Vance, female, age 4, placed into emergency state custody. The file slipped from his numb fingers and hit the concrete floor with a soft thud. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. The journalists, Marcus and Anna Vance, had been working on an expose, an investigation into a series of shell corporations buying up property on the South Side. And the man behind it all, the ultimate beneficiary, was Silas Thorne. Jack saw it all now, a decade too late. Thorne hadn't wanted a story coming out. He hadn't just silenced 2 reporters. He had orchestrated their murder and made it look like an accident. And Jack Callahan had been the detective who signed off on it. He had been the one who rubber-stamped the lie, who closed the book on their murders, who unknowingly helped orphan their daughter. The debt he owed Maya wasn't just for his life, it was for hers. The one he had, through his own willful blindness and careless indifference, helped destroy. Guilt is a relentless detective. It doesn't sleep, it doesn't take breaks, and its jurisdiction has no borders. For Jack Callahan, it had taken up permanent residence in his soul, and its first order of business was to reopen the Vance case. He couldn't do it officially. The tendrils of Silas Thorne's influence ran deep, and Jack no longer knew who in the department he could trust. The neat, tidy way the original investigation had been shut down was proof enough of that. So he moved in the shadows, using old contacts and calling in favors he had banked over 30 years. His first stop was a dead end. The building where the Vances had lived was torn down years ago, replaced by a soulless glass and steel condo Tawera property developed by a subsidiary of Thorne Consolidated. A calculated erasure. Next, he tried to find the neighbor who had recanted her statement, Maria Sanchez. Her files showed she had moved to Arizona a month after the Vances' deaths. Jack found a number for her through a retired colleague in Phoenix. When he called, the woman who answered listened to his introduction. Then there was a sharp intake of breath and the distinct, final click of a disconnected line. He tried again, and the number was already blocked. 10 years later, the fear was still potent enough to slam a door in the face of a cop 1,000 miles away. He was chasing ghosts, hitting a fortress of silence, built brick by Thorne's money and intimidation. Frustrated, Jack sat in the pre-dawn gloom of a 24-hour bar, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating in front of him. He wasn't drinking, he was thinking. The question wasn't just how Thorne had done it, but why he had targeted Jack now. A decade was a long time. Why not leave the sleeping dog of the Vance case lie? And then, with chilling clarity, the answer materialized. His retirement. Thorne wasn't a man who left things to chance. He was a master of risk management. A working Detective Callahan was predictable, buried in caseloads, too busy to look back. But a retired Jack Callahan? A man with too much time on his hands, a pension, and a lifetime of nagging what-ifs. That was a liability. A loose end. Thorne hadn't acted out of revenge or fear of immediate exposure. He had acted out of cold, preemptive strategy. Isabella hadn't been an assassin sent for retribution. She had been a corporate tool sent to quietly decommission a depreciating asset. The coldness of it settled deep in his bones. He wasn't just a target. He was a line item on a risk assessment spreadsheet. His next move was clear. Isabella was the only direct link. She was scared, but she was also a survivor. Locked in a cell, facing life in prison, her instinct for self-preservation might finally outweigh her fear of Thorne. He had to make her talk. He drove to the Cook County Jail, the gray morning light doing little to lift the oppressive atmosphere of the place. He flashed his badge at the front desk, his face a grim mask. "I'm here to see Isabella Rossi. It's imperative I speak with her." The duty sergeant, a thick-necked man named O'Malley, didn't look up from his computer. "You're a little late for that, detective." "And what's that supposed to mean?" Jack asked, an uneasy feeling starting to crawl up his spine. O'Malley finally looked at him, his expression flat. "The Rossi woman was found dead in her cell an hour ago. Hung herself with a bedsheet. Paramedics just left." The words were delivered with the detached professionalism of a man used to delivering bad news. To Jack, they weren't news. They were a confirmation, a death certificate signed by Silas Thorne. The last living witness, the one person who could tie Thorne directly to the attempted murder, had been silenced. It was too neat, too clean. Another loose end, snipped. "I was the last one to speak with her," Jack stated, his voice hard as iron. "I need to see the scene, and her personal effects." O'Malley bristled at the command, but saw the look in Jack's eyes, the look of a man on the edge of a precipice, and wisely decided not to argue. He led him down a sterile corridor to an empty cell that smelled faintly of antiseptic. There was nothing to see. The scene was already scrubbed. "Her property's been boxed," O'Malley grunted, pointing to a small cardboard box on a nearby table. Jack sifted through the contents. A cheap romance novel, a tube of lip balm, a worn-out hair tie, and at the bottom, something that didn't belong. It wasn't a Bible. It was a well-read paperback copy of The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Jack froze. This didn't fit the Isabella he knew, the woman of fashion magazines and superficial glamour. Why would she have this book? A seminal work on race, justice, and America's moral failings. It was a message. He knew it instantly. She couldn't speak, so she had left a signpost. It wasn't for the guards or her lawyer, it was for him. She knew his mind was now consumed by the ghosts of the Vance case, by the young black girl he had wronged. This book was a key, chosen to resonate with his newfound guilt. He flipped through the pages, his heart pounding. There were no notes, no dog-eared corners. But on the inside back cover, almost invisible against the publisher's information, was a faint string of numbers, written lightly in pencil, as if it were a forgotten locker combination. 41.8781N, 87.6298W. It wasn't a code. It wasn't a phone number. Jack knew exactly what it was. A set of GPS coordinates. A breadcrumb left by a dead woman, pointing him into the heart of the darkness she could no longer face. It was her last, desperate act, either a final betrayal of Silas Thorne, or the first step in a trap meant just for him. The coordinates led Jack to a place where the city's ambitions went to die. A sprawling, forgotten complex of self-storage units on the industrial outskirts, rust bleeding down the corrugated metal walls like old wounds. The air smelled of damp concrete and decay. It was the perfect place to hide a secret. The unit number, 237, was scrawled next to the coordinates in the book. Jack found it at the end of a dimly lit row. The lock was cheap. A few minutes with the pocket toolkit he never left home without, and it clicked open. He slid the heavy door up, revealing a small, dark space packed with the detritus of a life hastily abandoned. Designer clothes in garment bags, expensive furniture draped in dusty sheets, and stacked boxes of kitchenware. It was Isabella's life, boxed up and waiting. He realized with a jolt that she must have been preparing to disappear long before she was caught. She knew the danger she was in. Tucked behind a stack of canvases from her short-lived painting phase was what he was looking for. A sleek, silver briefcase. It felt heavy, important. Inside, his breath caught. It was a treasure trove of evidence, a meticulously organized indictment of Silas Thorne. There were ledgers detailing money laundering schemes, offshore account numbers, and timelines of illicit activities. But the most damning items were a set of micro-cassette tapes. Jack pulled a small, outdated player from his car's glove box, a relic from his early surveillance days, and popped one in. Isabella's voice, clear and steady, filled the silence. She was speaking with Thorne. The conversation was cold, clinical. They were discussing Jack. "He's getting sentimental," Thorne's voice, smooth and menacing, rasped from the tiny speaker. "Retirement will make him reflective. We can't have him digging up old bones. The Vance situation needs to remain buried. You know what to do. Make it look natural. No loose ends." It was the smoking gun. The undeniable proof. A wave of grim triumph washed over Jack. He had him. And then the world exploded in a cacophony of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed violently against the metal walls, turning the storage complex into a dizzying kaleidoscope of panic. Tires screeched on wet pavement. Doors slammed. Shouted commands echoed through the narrow corridors. "Chicago PD, hands where I can see them." Jack spun around, his heart plummeting into his stomach. He was silhouetted in the doorway of the open unit, the briefcase in his hand. Standing there, illuminated by the strobing lights, was Detective Davis, his gun drawn, his expression hardened into one of cold disappointment. Behind him, a dozen uniformed officers fanned out, weapons raised. It was a setup, the perfect, elegant trap. "Davis, listen to me," Jack started, his mind racing. "It's not what it looks like. This is evidence against Thorne." "Drop the case, Jack," Davis commanded, his voice tight. "Now. There's evidence in here. Tapes." We had an anonymous tip, Jack," Davis said, his voice laced with a painful, genuine-sounding regret. "Said a decorated detective was meeting his dealer, picking up a shipment. I didn't want to believe it." He nodded to two officers. "Cuff him." As they forced his hands behind his back, another officer opened the briefcase. He pulled out the ledgers, the tapes, and two large, professionally sealed bricks of cocaine that hadn't been there a moment ago. They were planted on top, impossible to miss. The truth hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. The tip-off, the planted drugs, Davis's convenient arrival, it was all orchestrated. Thorne hadn't just been cleaning up a loose end with Isabella. He had been setting the stage for this very moment. He hadn't just neutralized a threat. He was destroying a reputation, salting the earth of a 30-year career. Any evidence Jack now presented would be seen as the desperate act of a dirty cop trying to frame an upstanding citizen to cover his own crimes. The ride to the station was a blur of shame and fury. He was read his rights, photographed, and stripped of his badge and weapon. He was no longer Detective Callahan. He was a suspect. His colleagues, men he'd shared holidays and stakeouts with, wouldn't meet his eye. He was placed in a holding cell. The irony, a bitter pill. As the steel door clanged shut, only one thought consumed him. Maya. She was no longer just a witness. She was the one living link to the Vance case, the last person who could corroborate the past. With him discredited, she was exposed. Thorne's network was vast. He would find out where she was. A girl in the system, especially one with no family to raise a fuss, was an easy target. She could have an accident. She could run away and never be seen again. Another loose end. Jack knew he couldn't protect her from inside this cell. He couldn't trust the system that had just been so easily turned against him. There was only one option left. He had one phone call. He didn't call a lawyer. He called the one person he knew still owed him a favor, a grizzled old bail bondsman with a flexible moral code and a deep Rolodex. It would cost him his entire pension, but freedom was priceless. He had to get out. And then he had to disappear. It took a full day. But the bondsman, pulling every string he had, managed the impossible. Out on bail and stripped of everything but the clothes on his back, Jack Callahan walked away from the precinct, not as a cop, but as a fugitive. His first and only destination was the CPS center. He slipped in through a side entrance he'd noted earlier, a shadow moving through the sterile, quiet halls. He found Maya in a small common room, staring blankly at a television. He knelt beside her, his presence startling her. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Right now. You're not safe here." She looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of fear. She saw the desperation on his face, the hunted look of a man who had lost everything. This wasn't a cop coming to check on her. This was something else entirely. For the second time in a week, she had to make a choice. Trust the broken system, or trust the broken man in front of her. "Where are we going?" she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "I don't know yet," Jack answered truthfully. "But we're going together." She looked at his outstretched hand. It was the hand of a man who had failed her family a decade ago, but it was also the hand of the only person who believed her now. She took it. Together, a disgraced white cop and a homeless black girl slipped out into the Chicago night, becoming ghosts of their own making, running from a monster they could no longer see but could both feel closing in. The world shrank to the size of a moving car. Days bled into nights, measured not by clocks but by gas station fill-ups and the miles ticking over on the dashboard of a battered, untraceable sedan Jack had bought for cash from a shady contact. The same contact had provided a cheap, unregistered handgun that now sat heavy in the glove compartment in uncomfortable necessity. They were two fugitives, adrift in the American heartland, moving south through a patchwork of anonymous motels, truck stops, and forgotten highways. Life on the run was a tense, quiet rhythm. Jack, trained in surveillance, taught Maya the art of blending in. Don't meet anyone's eyes. Pay with cash. Never stay in one place for more than a night. Maya, a natural survivor, absorbed it all. She was used to being invisible. This was just a different kind of alley. The forced proximity chipped away at the walls between them. In the quiet hours of long drives, silence gave way to stories. Maya spoke of her life on the streets, not with self-pity, but with a pragmatism that broke Jack's heart. She talked about the shelters, the other kids, the constant grinding fear. She told him about the subtle codes of survival and the unspoken rules that governed the lives of those the world had left behind. Jack, in turn, found himself speaking about his own life with a candor he hadn't used in years. He didn't talk about the case, not yet. He talked about his ex-wife, who had left him because the job had consumed him whole. He talked about the son he rarely saw. He spoke of the compromises and the regrets, the small erosions of the soul that came with a 30-year career in law enforcement. He was no longer just a cop to her, and she was no longer just a case to him. He saw the sharp intelligence behind her guarded eyes, her dry, unexpected humor. She saw the weary decency beneath his gruff exterior, the guilt he carried like a second skin. They were a strange, fractured pair, a man running from the system he had upheld, and a girl running from the one that had failed her. An unlikely, unofficial father and daughter, bound by a shared enemy. The breakthrough happened on a rainy afternoon in a cheap motel room outside Memphis. The air was thick with the smell of damp carpet and old cigarette smoke. A news report flickered on the small television, showing a picture of Silas Thorne cutting the ribbon at a new charity hospital. The anchor praised him as a pillar of the Chicago community. Seeing his face's mug, powerful, untouchable on the screen, acted as a key, unlocking a door in Maya's mind that had been rusted shut for a decade. She went rigid, her eyes fixed on the television. "His ring," she whispered, her voice tight. "What?" Jack asked, turning down the volume. The man from that night," she said, her breath coming faster. "He wore a ring. It was a snake." Jack's blood ran cold. He knew the ring. Thorne was famous for Ita heavy gold signet ring, and Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. It was his signature piece, a gaudy symbol of his philosophy of eternal renewal and ruthless self-interest. "Maya, look at me," Jack said, his voice low and steady, trying not to spook her. "What else do you remember about that night? About the man?" She closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. The memories were no longer just flashes. They were becoming a coherent sequence, a film reel replaying in the dark theater of her mind. "He smelled clean," she said, the sensory detail startlingly clear, like expensive soap and something sharp. like lemons. He wasn't yelling. My parents were. But he was calm. He was talking low. He told my dad, he said. She struggled with the words. He said, secrets should be buried with the people who keep them. Oh. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the motel's rattling air conditioner. It was a direct quote from the grave. And my mom, Maya continued, a single tear, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She was scared, but she was angry too. She looked at me, right before he made her take me to my room. She squeezed my hand, so tight, and she whispered something. This was it. The final piece. Jack held his breath. What did she whisper, Maya? Maya's eyes snapped open, a decade of fog finally clearing. The memory was suddenly, painfully, crystal clear. She said, remember the fireplace, baby. The truth is in the fireplace. Don't you ever forget the fireplace. Jack remembered the crime scene photos from the old Vance file. The living room had a brick fireplace, old and unused. He had barely given it a glance, focusing on the faulty boiler in the adjacent kitchen. Did she say where? Jack pressed, his heart hammering. Where in the fireplace? Maya nodded, her eyes shining with a terrible, newfound certainty. There was a loose brick. My dad was always going to fix it. The third one from the left, on the bottom. She showed me how it came out once. We used to hide my favorite toys in there so my cousin couldn't find them. There it was. A secret hiding place. A child's game turned into a mother's last, desperate gambit to preserve the truth. It had to be her parents' notes, their evidence. The one thing Thorne's cleanup crew would have missed. The one thing they couldn't have known about. The risks were immense. The old house was in Chicago, the heart of Thorne's territory. Going back was walking directly into the lion's den. But they had no choice. It was the only move they had left on the board. Okay, Jack said, his voice imbued with a new, steely resolve. Okay, we're going back. And the drive back to Chicago was a silent, high-stakes pilgrimage. They traveled only at night, the car, a ghost slipping through the darkness. Jack could feel Thorne's net tightening, the sense that they were moving toward a conclusion that could only end in one of two ways. There was no middle ground left. Maya's old neighborhood was a ghost of a different kind. The vibrant community she vaguely remembered had been hollowed out, replaced by chain stores and generic new construction. But her family's house, a small two-story brownstone, was still standing, miraculously untouched. It was boarded up, derelict, a decaying tooth in a row of new veneers, slated for demolition. A forgotten relic. Under the cover of a moonless sky, Jack pried a board from a back window. They slipped inside, the air thick with the dust of a decade of neglect. Moonlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating furniture shrouded in white cloths, silent specters in the gloom. The living room, Maya whispered, her voice a small echo in the cavernous silence. She led him to the fireplace. It was exactly as he remembered from the crime scene photos. Jack knelt, his flashlight beam dancing over the old bricks. He counted them. Third from the left, on the bottom row. He pulled a crowbar from his bag and gently worked it into the mortar. The brick came loose with a grating scrape. Behind it, nestled in the dark, dusty cavity, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Jack's hands trembled as he pulled it out. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing a small, black, leather-bound notebook. He opened it. The pages were filled with her parents' neat, precise handwriting. It was everything. Dates, account numbers, transcribed recordings, and a detailed map of Thorne's money-laundering empire, connecting his legitimate businesses to a network of offshore accounts and illegal enterprises. It was a journalistic masterpiece, a meticulously built case against a king. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Jack froze, pushing Maya behind him, his hand reaching for the handgun in his waistband. They weren't alone. A touching reunion with your old home, Detective. A familiar voice drawled from the top of the stairs. Detective Davis stood there, not in a suit, but in dark tactical gear, a silenced pistol in his hand. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was Thorne's private security. I have to admit, Jack, you're more resourceful than we gave you credit for, Davis said, descending the stairs slowly. When Thorne's sources told him you'd been asking about the Vance case, he knew you'd eventually find your way back here. He just wanted the notebook. But you and the girl, are loose ends. Two other armed men materialized from the shadows behind him. The trap had been sprung. It's over, Davis, Jack said, his voice low and steady. This notebook will bury him. Davis chuckled, a cold, Empty sound. A notebook? Jack, you're a wanted fugitive. She's a runaway. Who do you think they're going to believe? Now, hand it over. Thorne wants this to be clean. But Jack had planned for this. He had learned from Thorne. He never walked into a situation without an insurance policy. He hadn't been idle during their days on the road. He's right here, Jack said, not to Davis, but speaking clearly towards his own chest. He's admitting to the cover-up. The notebook is secure. Davis's smile faltered. What are you talking about? Who are you talking to? From outside, the sudden, deafening sound of a bullhorn shattered the night. FBI, this is Special Agent Kendrick. The house is surrounded. Drop your weapons now. Floodlights ignited, blasting through the windows and obliterating the shadows. Red laser sights danced across Davis's chest. He stared at Jack, his face a mask of pure disbelief and fury. He had been outmaneuvered. Jack hadn't trusted anyone local. From a burner phone in Memphis, he had contacted the one person he knew Thorne couldn't touch, a fiercely independent federal prosecutor he'd worked with years ago on a task force. At first, she was skeptical. A wanted cop calling with a conspiracy theory? But Jack was desperate and convincing. He'd taken a risk, sending her a single, encrypted photo of a page from Isabella's briefcase before it was confiscated, a page detailing an offshore account. It was enough to pique her interest. He told her about the fireplace, about Maya's memory. He used the notebook as bait, knowing Thorne would send his men, and gambling that the FBI would believe him enough to watch. Davis and his men dropped their weapons. The raid was swift and overwhelming. As they were led away in cuffs, Jack saw the final, satisfying pieces of the puzzle fall into place. Silas Thorne was arrested at a charity gala an hour later, the flash of FBI credentials a stark contrast to the flashbulbs of the press. The notebook, authenticated by handwriting experts and corroborated by the evidence Isabella had collected, was the final nail in his coffin. The vast, corrupt empire he had built crumbled. Jack was cleared of all charges, his name restored. He was offered his old job back, a hero's welcome. He politely declined. He was done. His war was over. Months later, the autumn sun cast a warm, golden light over the gravesites at Oakwood Cemetery. Jack stood with Maya, placing a bouquet of lilies on the polished granite headstone that bore the names Marcus and Anna Vance. He had used some of his reinstated pension to give them the memorial they had always deserved. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly, the words directed at the stone, but meant for the girl beside him. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Maya looked up at him. The guarded, haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. She reached out and took his hand. "You saw it when it mattered," she said. He had completed the long, arduous process of becoming her legal guardian. They had a small, quiet apartment on the north side, far from the ghosts of their past. It wasn't a palace, but for the first time in a decade, it was a home. They stood there for a long moment, not a disgraced cop and a homeless girl, not a white man and a black child, but something new, something forged in fire and truth. They were survivors. They were a family. And as they turned to leave, walking together into the sunlight, they were finally, truly free.